Welcome. My name is Lara Milligan. I am the Natural Resources Agent. I work for the University of Florida. We call ourselves UF IFAS Extension. So we are an extension of the University of Florida. There's offices in every single county in the state. So I'm here in Pinellas County, and I'm stationed up at Brooker Creek Preserve, which is why I was asked to be here today. So I'm going to quickly just kind of introduce our team because I feel like it's important to get a feel for what we can really manage to do with our team. Do an overview of the preserve itself and the education center where my office is located, and then talk a little bit more about the natural history, which is kind of where you guys might be most interested in. So this is our team. We're only a team of 4. We have 3 full-time, 1 part-time employee, and myself and James Stevenson are countywide responsibility, and then Julia and Sherry are just dedicated to Brooker. So we're kind of spread thin when you think about just what we have. So we really focus on our volunteers, which I'm sure you guys rely heavily on as well. So we have an awesome, awesome team. And then we also have rangers on site that support kind of what we call public use areas, our hiking trails, and just keep the preserve looking well, and public safety is also part of their focus. So one of the things that was mentioned is just what is our mission and our history. So this is our very long mission, but one of the things that we stress in Extension, who I work for, is empowering citizens to improve their quality of life. That's one thing that you'll always hear. And so on the environmental side, it's through research-based educational programs focused on natural, cultural, and historical resources, and we share this mission with our sister preserve down at Weeden Island in St. Pete. So, and just briefly, if you're not familiar with Extension, we cover a wide area of topics. We're a free resource for the public, so any urban landscaping stuff, we have urban horticulture, lawn and garden. Then we have natural resources, which is myself, and we have Sea Grant, which is marine and coastal. Families and consumers, that position's currently vacant, but they do money management and food and nutrition. And then we have sustainable living, photo-friendly landscaping, more landscaping. And then 4-H is our youth component of Extension. And our main office is down at the Florida Botanical Gardens, and then we have the 2 satellite offices, which are the 2 big preserves in Pinellas County. So one of the reasons the satellite offices are nice is because it helps us to reach more people in this very awkward shaped county. So again, main office down there, and then I'm stationed way up there typically, and then Weeden Island's down south. And then Brooker Creek Preserve is the largest remaining natural area in Pinellas County. So it's a very special place, pretty much the only green you can see on the map when you look at Pinellas County, with the exception of Weeden Island. So the lands themselves of Brooker Creek are owned by Pinellas County mostly. There's a small chunk that is owned by the Southwest Florida Water Management District. But everything is pretty much managed by our Parks and Conservation Resources Department in terms of the lands, and then within the buildings, Pinellas County Extension is the staff that runs that. So the preserve itself, this is an aerial image. I got to fly over, so it's not the best quality, but this is just me taking a snapshot with my cell phone of the preserve. So it was established in the early 1990s, and since then we've acquired several thousand more acres, and we now stand at over 8,700 acres, which is pretty massive. There's not a whole ton we can still acquire at this point, but we're proud to still have that. And I already mentioned, but for the largest remaining natural area, we say that anytime we get a chance, because we are very proud of that. And then, so this is just another snapshot, kind of showing it in relation to Lake Tarpon up in North County. And then this also shows, I don't know if this laser works, probably not on the TV, our trail system, which is mostly in the north end of the preserve. The red trails are our horse trails, believe it or not. And then we also have about 4 miles of hiking trails as well. So within the preserve, historically, before the big economic downturn, we had tons of staff out there doing research. And this is what was documented by previous staff. So we have over 600 floral species documented, 20 mammal species, close to 200 bird species, 60 reptiles and amphibians, and close to 200 invertebrate species, all found within the preserve. And we like to, our tagline is Pinellas County's wildest place. So, and here's just a few, this is like a little virtual tour I typically take people through of some of the things that you may see if you look very closely. So we have lots of snakes, which I know not everybody gets excited about. Lots of gopher tortoises as well. This is a pretty rare lily that requires fire in order to grow and thrive and reproduce. So during certain times of years, people will come just seeking to find this lily. It's called the Catesby lily. We have coyotes, which we typically see more evidence of. We also have some trail cameras set up, so we can also see them that way as well. Lots of alligators, tons of different birds, some fun orchids. And right now, especially, caterpillars are everywhere. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but especially at the preserve, we have them everywhere. We also have lots of venomous snakes, but we look at everything from a nice, safe distance. And deer are pretty common there as well. And this one, I like this one because he's kind of camouflaged, but there's a great blue heron in the background there. Owls on occasion. Pygmy rattlesnakes are by far the #1 snake species that we see at the preserve. So, in terms of the ecosystems that we see at the preserve, the really cool thing is on our shortest trail system, which is just we call it the Education Center Trail Loop. It's just a half-mile loop. You can see pretty much most of the ecosystems we have at the preserve. So it's almost a 50-50 split between kind of the higher, drier uplands and the lower, wetter wetlands. Obviously, we have Brooker Creek, our namesake, flowing through the preserve. And then its floodplain, when we get a lot of rain, will flood a big area, creating a big swampy area that's beautiful, especially during certain times of the year. So I'm not going to get into the details of the different ecosystem types, but we do have a lot to feature there just within our trail system. And so these are just some images back in the day when I used to make it to work very early and get some sunrise photos. So this is the floodplain area of Brooker Creek. Some of the cypress swamps. So in terms of the buildings on site, we have 3 buildings. There's our auditorium building, which is where we have all of our classes. What we call the exhibit hall, which is where we have this multi-million-dollar hands-on interactive, it's basically like a little museum for children to learn about Pinellas County's natural resources, specifically Brooker. And then our classroom, we host a different 4th grade class, all public schools north of Ulmerton Road. If they're in 4th grade, they will come through our facility, and we have a dedicated classroom teacher for that as well. The building's opened in 2004, so relatively new, and you can rent these facilities through our vendor if anyone is ever interested. We do weddings and things like that as well. Hello. In terms of what visitors can experience while they're at the preserve, really, the preserve was created for residents to experience and understand and enjoy native Florida, so we help them to do this through a variety of ways. One is passive recreation, just through our hiking trail system, and then we do a ton of different educational programs as well throughout the year. One of our things that we really mostly realized during COVID is something kind of unique that we offer is guided hikes. That's not really something that's offered in many places throughout the county and the parks system. So we offer guided hikes every single Saturday morning, year-round. Occasionally, typically seasonally, we'll do Fridays when it's a little bit nicer out and we have our snowbirds here. And each hike will tend to have a little bit of a different focus. A lot of them are run by our volunteers, and staff occasionally do them as well. And then in terms of youth programs, we have book time every single Thursday for littles. This is like our preschool. Again, every Thursday, 10:30 to 11:15, they read a nature-based book and do an activity. And then once a month, we have family fun Friday mornings with our homeschool youth. And then Saturday, it's like all over the place. We offer a ton of different programs. I'll showcase some of them at the end, but if you go to brookercreekpreserve.org, pretty easy to remember, you can find all of the programs right there on our homepage. And we are supported by an amazing friends group, Friends of Brooker Creek Preserve. So they do a ton of stuff, which I don't have time to list everything here, but they support some of our bigger events that we do. We just finished the wildlife safari in early April, and then they do things like music in the woods just to try and get people to come out to the preserve for maybe other reasons than hiking. If they're not into that, they do night hikes, which is another very unique experience, and they support our nature store, which in turn those proceeds come back to fund educational programs. Okay, so I'm now going to get into probably what you guys are mostly interested in, which is the natural history, but I wanted to give some background about the preserve before I did that. So I know you just walked in, but any questions so
Did
far?
they have a like a schedule of when they do the different events and stuff, or do you just get on the website?
The website's the best way. For our bigger events, Wildlife Safari is always in April, and then our Fall Wildflower Festival is always in October.
Okay.
So spring and fall are kind of our big event times, but programs are all throughout the year. So what I want to talk about, right, we have 8,700 acres that we have to manage. We have limited staff to do that, but I'm going to talk about some of the things that we do on the lands and the importance of that as it relates to our natural history. So I'm going to talk about prescribed burns, responding to wildfires, invasive species management, and then I'll do one little piece, because I love water, I'm going to throw in a little piece about water management as well. So wildfires and prescribed burns. I like talking about fire because it's typically seen by the public as a negative thing, but they can actually be really beneficial to plants, wildlife, and people. So in terms of plants, I mentioned already that rare Catesby lily actually needs fire in order to survive. So there's some plants that literally would not exist without fire. It can also, as the fire goes through, it can open up the tree canopy, which allows sunlight to reach the forest floor, which of course plants need sunlight to survive. So if it gets really densely vegetated and a fire comes through, it can help with, again, opening up the tree canopy, killing off invasive plants. Nobody likes invasive plants if you know much about them, so fire is really beneficial for that. And the really, I think, interesting thing, this is a lot more evident when we offer guided hikes, is maintain existing historical habitat. So this is a pine flatwoods habitat. This would historically, before people were here, lightning would strike these habitats and it would burn about every 2 to 5 years. And so all of these plants that are found here have adapted to fire over thousands of years. The issue is, as people moved in, we did this thing called fire suppression, where if a fire started, our thing was put it out immediately, which was great for us, but not great for our ecosystems. So as we keep fire out of a pine flatwoods ecosystem, other trees like oak trees can start to grow up, which are not adapted to survive fire. But eventually they can grow up, they will shade everything else out, and it completely transforms the ecosystem into something else. So we've now lost any of the plants and animal species, I shouldn't say any, majority of the plant and animal species that would have historically been found in a pine flatwoods ecosystem. So this is called an oak hammock. Oaks grow up. Again, it's very shady, so there's limited understory. It looks very different. And this, without fire, we'd have just like a monocrop of oak hammock. In terms of wildlife, this is by far the #1 concern when we do a prescribed burn or there's a wildfire at the preserve. The #1 concern we get from people is the animals. So, and I will say, there is loss of animals when there's fire. We cannot avoid that, but in terms of overall populations, there's no significant harm. Animals that live within, this is like what I just showed you, in that pine flatwoods ecosystem, right? If they're dependent, like the gopher tortoise, on that ecosystem, then without fire, if it turns into an oak hammock, we're going to lose that species altogether. So certain animals depend on those ecosystems. And when we have a fire, it creates this very nutrient-dense, basically soil. The plants that are now re-sprouting are taking in all of these nutrients that have been cycled from this fire, and it creates this fresh, tender growth that's very, very full of healthy things for the animals. So they go crazy after a fire. You'll see animals coming in to chomp on that. So they're getting those extra nutrients. Fresh, tender growth I just mentioned, and it clears out the densely vegetated areas, which allows for easier movement of wildlife. This is just a cute little baby gopher tortoise that we found. So in terms of benefits to us, this in itself could be a whole lecture, but in order for fire to occur, there's 3 elements that are necessary: heat, fuel, and oxygen. So, right, obviously oxygen's always here. Fuel is the vegetation in a particular area, and then the heat would be like the ignition source for the fire to occur. So typically, historically, that would be lightning. The benefit of fire is that the amount of fuel, right, that's really the only thing we could really control, is if we put a fire through with prescribed fire, like we set it on fire, we're going to knock down the fuel load, as we like to call it. So the vegetation's been burned down. So if lightning was to strike afterwards, there's now less vegetation that could burn, so it wouldn't be as, I guess, a devastating a fire. So prescribed fire is very beneficial for maintaining healthy fuel loads, I guess, if we want to go there. So, and this is just an example of how these ecosystems have adapted to fire. This was a wildfire that happened in June 2012. So we went out pretty shortly after the fire happened to take pictures, and then I went back 1 month later just to show how the ecosystem has rebounded. So that's that same area just 1 month later. This is actually from a prescribed burn they did for a training class, and this is like our little island in our parking lot, but you can see again just 1 month later. You probably wouldn't even know that there was a fire. This is on the drive in. This is from another prescribed fire, just showing 1 month comparison. And same here. And you can see, so this particular species, this is an oak tree, and you can see that is not going to survive. So that's one of the benefits. If it's in a pine flatwoods ecosystem, it's going to knock those oaks back down to keep it as a pine flatwoods. Okay. Any questions about fire? All right, so quickly, invasive species management. We unfortunately have a lot of invasive species that we have to manage, both plants and animals. Feral hogs are probably the #1 thing that we manage in terms of animals, and plants, it's numerous. Oh no, I don't know why it's like that. It's supposed to be my pop quiz for you guys, but if you can read that. But I was curious if you guys can read what's on the screen. We like to emphasize what actually is an invasive species, because there's lots of misconceptions or misunderstandings of what they are. So, is it an organism that causes ecological or economic harm in a new environment where it is non-native? A native species that is overgrown or taken over an area? A species that has come onto my property that I don't want there? Or a species that is not native to the habitat under consideration? Any guesses?
All of the above.
Yeah.
Or you say all of the above.
Yeah, so essentially, so letter A kind of encompasses a lot of the all of the above. So it is a species that's not native to the habitat under consideration, but the extra add-on piece is that it causes some type of harm, whether it's economic or ecological harm. And if you know anything about these invasive species, they can totally take over, in terms of animals, native wildlife habitat. So right, this is air potato, which maybe you were familiar with, and it can just completely take over, and you're removing all of the diversity and shading out all of our native plants and all the animals that depend on it. This is a Cuban tree frog. Oh, that's one I had to capture. That's me holding it with a leaf. So you can see how big this thing is. And I've actually witnessed them eating our native tree frogs. So they're definitely posing threats to our native species, not only our native tree frogs, but other species that they prey upon as well. So one of the things we like to stress, so in Extension, we're all about behavior change. We want people to make better choices for themselves and for the environment. So we always encourage people, if you are going to purchase plants, we obviously want to make sure that we're not purchasing invasive species, which unfortunately are still being sold in many of our stores. So there's two resources we like to mention. There's the assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas, which is part of the University of Florida. So you could just type in, University of Florida plant assessment or something, and it would probably come up in an online search. And then the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, they put out a list every 2 years of species that are considered invasive. So this is what the assessment looks like. When you go onto the site, you can type in the common name, or if you are fancy and know the Latin, you can type in the scientific name, and you scroll down and it'll tell you specifically, depending where you are in Florida, if that species is considered invasive, or if it's like, caution, we're still doing research and we don't quite know. So it gives you all the details there. So this is an example. This is a very common landscape plant that is planted and used. And you can see if you type it in, it will tell you right here, it is invasive. There's no uses for this plant here in Florida. Yes. I know. There are sterile varieties that they have come up with, but
Can I ask a question about the invasive species?
yeah.
Are the plants simply because maybe birds cause a lot of the plant invasive species?
It definitely doesn't, yes, they do not help in the situation for sure. A lot of the species made it here, well, I shouldn't say accidentally. It's a mix of either they made it here, from just being transported on a ship, like accidentally, or a lot of plant species, we thought they were beautiful, like Brazilian pepper. We're like, oh, look at these beautiful berries, and we just didn't know. And then, of course, yes, the birds will eat the berries, and so it makes it, if we're planting them in your yard, then we don't really have control over what the animals do in terms of spreading it.
And how about the animals? Like, how would they become, how would an invasive species of animal, other than, I know some people bought pets in.
Yeah, pet releases is probably one of the #1 ways, and then also a lot of shipping, because Florida has so many ports. It's like, a Cuban tree frog could easily, I actually had a guy just email me, I think he was in Louisiana, and he's like, hey, I just bought a cabbage palm, from Florida. He's like, and I just found a Cuban tree frog, I'm pretty sure, it came over on that, so there's just so many ways for invasive, especially animals, to make their way as people just go about their business traveling. So this is just a picture of what the plant list looks like for the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. So it lists them all by scientific name, common name, where it's found in Florida, north, central, or south. And it tells you up above how bad it is. And this is kind of like getting at what you were saying. And what we like to emphasize, so this is again another aerial shot of Brooker Creek out of the airplane. And we're completely surrounded by development. The reason that it's like this only chunk of green you see on the map is because it's surrounded by development. So yeah, what people do in their yards all around the preserve can easily, transfer directly there. So one of the other things that I mentioned, I would throw in a little piece about water. So the light green outline that you see on the screen is something called a watershed. This is the Brooker Creek watershed. So any rain that falls within that green area, if it's basically not evaporated and doesn't infiltrate into the ground, if it's running across the land, it will ultimately channel into Brooker Creek, and Brooker Creek ultimately flows into Lake Tarpon. Yeah. I don't know why they call it a watershed. It's probably the most difficult term for people to understand and grasp, so as an educator, it's a challenge, but it's basically just, again, an area of land that captures water and funnels it to another larger body of water. The critical thing for us and all of the people that live around this area is that whole, especially the preserve within that chunk of the watershed, provides a massive amount of flood storage. So we do have some neighborhoods kind of like on the south, well no, even on this side of the preserve, just on the outskirts of the preserve that still experience flooding. And I'm like, well yes, well we built like within the watershed. So, and within kind of the Brooker Creek Preserve floodplain of the creek. So yeah, without the preserve though, like imagine how much more flooding would occur. There's so much water that can be stored in the 8,700 acres that we have. And of course, that gives water a chance to infiltrate and percolate down into the groundwater, which is a major source of drinking water for really the entire state. And protects the next watershed over, which is the Lake Tarpon watershed. So this was just one example. This is our boardwalk that is definitely designed to be well above the water. This was from, I don't know if it was Tropical Storm Debbie. It was one that just like sat here, and we got 26 inches of rain in 1 month period. And our boardwalk system was underwater, which there's a land manager who's been with the county since he was like 18, and he's about to retire, and he said he's never seen this before. So it was a pretty amazing thing to experience, so of course we went out tromping around. And then one other piece, kind of really on the historical side. So this is a display that we have inside our education center. It features, well, there's several other aerial images, but I just featured the latest one and then the most recent one. So from 1926, so this is Lake Butler, which is now Lake Tarpon, and then to 2002. Fast forward, and you can just see the significant changes over time. There was ag lands down here, which you can kind of make out, but now it is completely all neighborhoods all throughout the area. Brooker Creek is very well outlined now. You can see that they added this outflow from Lake Tarpon, so that people along the lake had a consistent level of water for their waterfront property. So lots and lots of changes to our landscape, which has huge impacts for water quality and quantity as well. And I always like to ask this question. It's kind of another pop quiz, which is, do you live in a watershed? And the answer is yes. We all live in a watershed, no matter where you live in the world. So there's an older map online, which is this screenshot here. It's just, I like to use this as a one-stop shop, where you could, depending where you live, you can look at this map and see which watershed you live in. It's typically associated with which body of water your water that runs off your property will ultimately flow into. So like I live in the Bishop Creek watershed, so obviously the water from my property flows into Bishop Creek, which ultimately flows into Old Tampa Bay. So it's just fun to figure out which watershed you live in and kind of get that connection with your water. There's now an interactive map where you can literally type in your address and it will tell you through, you could probably just do a search for Pinellas County watershed and the GIS site would probably pop up. So we do have several programs. I mentioned we do a lot of programs on Saturdays, and we're also, with COVID, like everybody, we started to do a lot of webinars, and we've kept that going because we've had great success with it. So I'll be doing a webinar, I guess that's next Tuesday, I think, on different tree species that look similar and can easily be confused and how to tell them apart. We have, if anyone's into art, we have a plein air event coming up. It's a couple days of the event, and then they do an awards ceremony on the last day. If you have any youth in your family that are into frogs, on April 30th, this presentation is taught by a youth, Actually, she's probably not even a youth anymore. She was 11 years old when she first started presenting. She's a phenomenon on many levels, has a bigger CV and resume than probably all of our staff combined. So she's amazing. Her name's Avalon. She's probably in her 20s now. Anyway, she will be back to present on frogs. Then I'll be doing a presentation on stormwater, which nobody thinks that's fun to learn about stormwater, so I tried to come up with a fun title, Get Your Mind in the Gutter. But if you want to learn about stormwater, I'll be doing a webinar on May 4th. And then we have a big event put on, this is more an event put on by the county. It's called Lakes and Ponds Day. And that's if you have a lake or pond that you want to enhance or manage on your yard, property, HOA. They have all sorts of educational programs. They have vendors on site. They usually do a plant giveaway. So that's one of our bigger events coming up at the end of May. No, beginning of May. And then a quick plug for a couple little things. I have started a pilot program called Adopt a Drain, which I know doesn't sound exciting, but we have lots of storm drains in the county that easily get clogged with all sorts of leaf litter and debris, which has significant impacts to our water quality. And we just don't have the staff, county staff, to maintain all 12,000 of them that we have. So if you have one outside of your home or neighborhood that you're interested in maintaining, you could again just do a search online for Pinellas County Adopt a Drain and sign up for that. And I get you set up with all your equipment and train you and all the things. And we'd love to have you. If you are into podcasts, I do also host a podcast. We just do monthly episodes, so one a month. Our next one should be released Monday on coyotes. So if you're interested in tuning in, it's called Naturally Florida. And we also have a website. It's just naturallyfloridapodcast.com. But we're on all the major podcast platforms, so if you just type in Naturally Florida, we should pop up. That's our little icon with the alligator. And that's all I have for today, but there's a ton of my contact information on here. Again, brookercreekpreserve.org if you want to find out what we have going on. Pinellas County Extension.org for kind of the broader extension family. Again, my contact information, we are on Facebook. I am on Twitter as well, though not very active anymore. Okay, well thank you for having me, and if you've never been up to Brooker Creek, come and visit before it gets too hot, and I'll likely be there.